Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue the wonderful new book, Super Mafia, Organized Crime Threatens America by Jonathan Harris. This time we're going to start with chapter 2. So with the last chapter, we talked about a nice introduction to the world of the Mafia. This time though, it's going to talk about some juicy details about being inside the Mafia. In fact, that's the actual title of the chapter itself. It's called Inside the Mafia, with the first segment is How to Become a Mafioso. So if you ever wondered essentially the guidelines associated with that world and how to get in, well, guess what? You're in luck. You're going to find out some of that information here, at least in this part, and then I'll continue with some of the other parts going forward. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's start chapter 2. Again, the first topic is how to become a mafioso, and then here's what it says. You are entering into the honored society of Cosa Nostra, which welcomes only men of great courage and loyalty. You come in alive and you go out dead. The gun and knife are the instruments by which you live and die. Cosa Nostra comes first, above everything else in your life, before family, before country, before God. When you are summoned, you must come even if your mother or wife or children are on their deathbed. There are 3 laws you must obey without question. You must never betray any of the secrets of this Cosa Nostra. You must never violate the wife or children of another member. You must never become involved with narcotics. The violation of any of these laws means death without trial or warning. Such was the oath administered to Jimmy Fratiano when he was inducted into the Mafia back in 1947. As he tells it in his 1982 biography, he then had to raise the index finger on his right hand. The capo who was inducting him pricked it with a pin. This drop of blood symbolizes your birth into our family. We are one until death. The capo concluded the ceremony by kissing him on both cheeks. Fratiano was now a made guy. From that day on, when a fellow mafioso introduced him to someone and wished to signal that Fratiano was a member, he would say, "This is a friend of ours." But if introducing Fratiano to a non-member, he would say instead, "This is a friend of mine." Until about 25 or 30 years ago, a requirement for admission to the Mafia was often to carry out a contract murder or to assist in one. This rule made undercover infiltration of the mob by law enforcement agents almost impossible, since they obviously could never meet this obligation. Today, the rule is usually waived. The main qualification now is the ability to make money in sufficient amounts to benefit the higher-ups. This is just one of several changes that make today's mafia different from that of the old days. Though there is still plenty of everyday violence and cold-blooded killing, law enforcement officials say they sense a growing tendency within the mob to resolve its problems in subtler and more sophisticated ways. As the oath Fratiano took indicates, a new mafioso was required to give absolute obedience to certain strictly enforced laws. Above all was the rule of omerta, or total silence and secrecy about mafia affairs to all outsiders under any and all conditions. Many mobsters suspected of even thinking about stooling, i.e. informing to the authorities, paid with their lives. Often, they disappeared without a trace. During his mob years, Fratiano took care of many of such informants. He built up an awesome reputation as one of the special kind who could be relied on to fulfill any murder contract swiftly and surely. He is believed to have made nearly 20 hits as the mob's West Coast executioner. No mafioso is ever paid for carrying out a contract. In Fratiano's own words, if you're given a contract, you've got to do the hit. His biographer described the intangible rewards. His reputation as a mafia enforcer created a certain aura that was useful in his business. He could get away with things that other men would never dare try. Others knew that if they retaliated, there would be dreadful repercussions. A mafia reputation, like the six-shooter of the Old West, was an equalizer. It turned little men into big men. It brought him respect through fear, and that was real power. Fratiano had a long and generally successful career in the mob, despite some years in prison. He is one of the few who eventually became disillusioned turned, became a government informant, and then lived. His testimony has so far sent about 30 of his former associates to jail. A young mobster hoping to build a rep as potent as Fratiano's has to prove he is a stand up guy. He has to show that he can face up to the most brutal kinds of punishment, whether from the law or from other criminals, and still keep his mouth shut about mob business and his fellow mobsters. Fratiano has proved his own toughness many times, yet he turned. Two factors made his survival possible after that. They demonstrate other changes currently going on, one in law enforcement and the other within the mob. The first is the federal government's witness protection program, which we shall discuss in detail later. Fratiano has been under its wing ever since an FBI agent and his own disgust with his colleagues persuaded him to cross that line. The second factor is the alleged deterioration in the quality of young mafioso in recent years. In this view, the third and fourth generation Italian Americans coming into the organization these days tend to prefer nonviolent, more business-like ways of operating. A capo in the Los Angeles mob told Fratiano he doubted over 15% of newer members were capable of carrying out a hit. Most guys just ain't got the stomach for it, he said. Some mob families have found a remedy for this problem. They smuggle illegal young aliens from Sicily into the United States. Despite their youth, many of these imports are experienced mafioso. More importantly, they have been trained in a tradition radically different from that of the younger American born mobsters. FBI agent Bob Langford explained the difference. These new guys don't ask why when a mob tells them to do something or a mob boss does. They just do it, no questions. Another solution increasingly in vogue is hiring members of outlaw motorcycle gangs to perform contract killings. Violence for its own sake and maintaining a macho image seem more highly valued among these bikers than among some mafioso. Next segment is called Paying Tribute. Once in the organization, a mafioso whose criminal activities are successful is expected to share the profits. Essentially, this means paying tribute to one's mob superiors. As one mobster explained to researcher Howard Abandinsky, the rule is stated this way: if you are going to eat, you don't eat alone. If you eat alone, you're going to die alone. Tribute payments bring certain benefits. Mob higher-ups often wield considerable political influence, which they can bring to bear to help a mafioso in trouble with the law. They can also help by hiring some of the most skilled, most highly paid attorneys in the country to defend an accused mobster. Tribute can also bring exclusive rights to a specific kind of activity within a given territory. It is, according to one mafioso, very much like paying for a McDonald's franchise. No competitors are permitted within your guaranteed area. The mob intensely dislikes unauthorized competition because it can lead to uncontrolled violence, which causes public outcries for stricter law enforcement and police crackdowns. The mob prefers to deal with such situations in its own inimitable manner. Abandinsky's mob informant provided a vivid description of the response. First, the would-be competitor gets a warning. If he persists, the second step is a carefully regulated dose of violence, enough to discourage, but not enough to kill. Should he prove foolish enough still to carry on, the procedure escalates to the ultimate. From the third step, you do not recover. And then the next segment is war within the mob. The Mafia's recent history does not bear out Fratiano's notion that the membership tends to shun violence. Some recent bloodlettings inside the mob have rivaled the goriest days of the 1920s and Al Capone's Chicago. In 1975 alone, there were over 200 gangland slayings. Philadelphia's Bruno War is the outstanding recent example. Over the past few years, this deadly intermob conflict has spread havoc through what once was one of the Mafia's smoothest running and most powerful families. Long run by Angelo Bruno, it had dominated Philadelphia and Atlantic City for several decades. As the listing on the following page demonstrates, the Bruno mob suffered at least 16 killings between 1980 and 1983. Others have followed since then. Mafia experts differ about the causes of the Bruno War. Some feel it was a battle for control of the rich Atlantic City rackets, traditionally a Bruno monopoly. New York's Gambino family is thought to have launched the onslaught in order to grab a piece of the Atlantic City action. Others suggest it was purely and simply a power struggle within the Bruno family. Underboss Philip Chicken Man Testa is supposed to have been undermining Bruno's power and plotting to take over the mob for some time. When Bruno was shot to death, Testa took his place as head of the family. He in turn was killed by a bomb blast apparently triggered as he entered his son's house in South Philadelphia. Some authorities believe that Testa's execution may have been carried out by members of a motorcycle gang called the Pagans, hired for this purpose. Testa was succeeded by Nicodermo Scarfo of Atlantic City. The New Jersey State Police have described Scarfo as a hoodlum who tries to live up to the image of a 20s gangster and a man who will resort to violence instantaneously. It is quite apparent that his lack of managerial skill, other than the indiscriminate use of violence and fear, has diminished the stature and effectiveness of this family to maintain exclusive control in Atlantic City. Then that's it. Let's go ahead and let's pause it here and then let's talk about all the new rich info that came about. So, for starters, as you can see, it pretty much involves an oath. There's a set of sayings that are done, like in terms of entering the honor society of Cosa Nostra and then giving everything else in your life to the Cosa Nostra before family, before country, before God. And then there's those three laws that they stated. One is that you must never betray those secrets. Yeah, and you must never violate the wife or children of another member, and you must never be involved with narcotics. Boy, it's interesting to see, though, how many of those were broken, right? By prominent, very prominent, in fact, mafioso members. I mean, one has to look at only like Henry Hill to see that he, in turn, not only was involved with narcotics, but basically became an informant. He became the number one most famous informant. And then there's other ones like Sammy the Bull Gravano that also became an informant. And then there's others that come to mind as well that just, it looks like the notion of that you must never ever betray your family, betray the Cosa Nostra in this type of manner wasn't taken so seriously, was it? There was interesting too that there was something else mentioned in this chapter that stood out. It was the idea that there was a deterioration of the mob, but the implication was that many of the newer members are more about business than about violence. Like, in other words, trying to make sure that they can run the mob as a business rather than making hits or doing contracts and so on. The idea that mobster said only about 15%, he theorized 15% of members can even take a hit or do a hit. Makes one wonder about that, like if that was true. But I would have thought that would have been more better for the mafia, no? Because otherwise, if you run it, let's say, as just a old west, as it was described in the chapter, as an old west team that's just shooting first and asking questions later, that can't exactly last these days. Like, that kind of stuff would require a lot of people to essentially take sacrifice in terms of the violence and then being killed and so on, and then too many law enforcements that would come at them because of all those killings, even if it's within the actual mafia members themselves. So I would have thought that the opposite, where the young mobsters are looking to instead become more businesslike, I thought that would make more sense. But who knows? It looks like at least that was the other thing that stood out. And then finally, there was a section there about paying tribute. We've seen that multiple times within the mafia world. You definitely have to pay upwards when it comes to your take. So that way you get all that protection, and then also you get all those favors afterward. And we've seen that in multiple movies and documentaries. So yeah, it was interesting that they also talked about that too. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.